In 1880, a woman in black kept an overnight vigil in Zululand, South Africa. She stayed exactly where her only beloved son had fallen in battle in 1879. This was Eugénie, Empress consort to Napoleon III. Once accustomed to the grandest palaces of France, she had expected her son to inherit the Bonaparte legacy. Instead, the royal throne was gone, and she sat alone in a foreign land. To fully understand the mother on that night, one must first understand the woman who lived for decades in exile in Hampshire. Behind the trees in Hampshire stood a red brick, half-timbered house. For years, an older woman dressed in black lived quietly in exile there. To the local people, she was simply a quiet, wealthy widow from abroad taking her daily walks. They could not easily connect this silent figure in the English countryside with the grand courts of Europe. Yet she was Eugénie de Montijo, wife of Napoleon III and Empress consort of the French Second Empire. For nearly 2 decades, she stood firmly at the center of French power. She governed the nation 3 times as regent during her husband's military absences. Some later accounts stretched the true scale of her political reach, yet her presence at the highest levels of the state was never in doubt. The contrast between her 2 lives was stark. The isolated woman in Hampshire was the exact same person who had once commanded the halls of the Tuileries Palace in Paris. She had presided over state balls, shaped imperial ceremonies, and defined the public face of a ruling dynasty. The wider world remembered her wearing the crown diamonds, while her English neighbors only knew her in mourning. How a celebrated empress became a solitary exile requires looking at the sequence of what she lost. The empire she had helped build collapsed rapidly. She lost the throne in a matter of days following the defeat of the French army at Sedan in 1870. She fled Paris in secret as a fugitive, taking only her most essential possessions with her. Exile soon claimed the rest of her world. Her husband died in England after a long period of illness. Then came the loss that could never be replaced. Her only son, the Prince Imperial, fell during the Anglo-Zulu War in South Africa, thousands of miles from her door. The defining tragedy of her life was not merely the scale of what she lost, but how long she lived after losing it all. Eugénie outlived her husband by 47 years and her son by 41 years. She sat in the quiet of Hampshire and watched as the royal houses that had shaped Europe fractured and fell. During her reign as empress, she maintained a documented interest in the life of Marie Antoinette. Both were foreign women brought into the center of French power. Both influenced the image of the state, and both became convenient targets when the political regime failed. Yet Eugénie made a very different choice at the end. When crowds marched on the Tuileries, she refused to use soldiers to keep the crown. To understand the woman in black, one must return to Granada, where Eugénie was born, on a night the earth shook. On May 5th, 1826, the ground in the city of Granada began to shake. An earthquake forced a pregnant woman out of her home and into a tent in the garden. There, under an open sky, she gave birth to a daughter. The family would later recall the circumstances of that night with jokes. They treated the event as an amusing memory rather than a prophecy of a turbulent life. The child was baptized Maria Eugenia de Guzmán Palafox y Portocarrero. She became known simply as Eugénie de Montijo. Her father, Don Cipriano, was a Spanish nobleman who had openly supported the Bonaparte cause in Spain. He admired the military legacy of Napoleon. Because of his loyalties, Eugénie grew up in a household filled with accounts of the French Empire. The name Napoleon shaped her imagination long before she ever met a man who carried it. The family also cultivated an intellectual environment. Writers like Prosper Mérimée and Stendhal were familiar friends of the household. Eugénie spent her early years absorbing conversations about literature, history, and European politics. She was raised in an environment that valued grand narratives and ambition. She listened to the adults debate the shifting borders of Europe. Stendhal's stories of a fallen empire became her standard. Eugénie shared her childhood with an older sister named Paca. In the drawing rooms they visited, the two sisters presented a contrast. Paca was gentle, gracious, and easily admired by the society figures of the day. Eugénie possessed a different temperament. She was strong, stubborn, and naturally drawn to physical challenges. She preferred riding horses at a fast pace and swimming in the cold waters of the sea. The family moved frequently, spending time in Spain, France, and England. This constant travel gave Eugénie a broad perspective. She spoke multiple languages fluently and navigated different cultural circles with ease. Yet, this transient lifestyle also meant she did not fully belong to one single nation. In the social circles of Europe, a familiar pattern began to take shape. Men noticed her immediately. Observers admired her striking appearance and her sharp mind. But that attention rarely turned into formal proposals. Society rewarded women who fit traditional expectations. Eugénie, with her bold nature and foreign background, was frequently watched but rarely selected. She was present, yet almost never the first choice for prominent families. This repeating experience taught her early that being admired was not the same as being chosen. She could command the attention of a room and still leave it without a future. The pain of not being chosen culminated in an emotional shock. No single account fully settles what happened. Some biographies suggest a suitor named Pepe paid attention to Eugénie but actually intended to court Paca. Others point instead to her deep attachment to the wealthy Duke of Alba, who eventually married her sister. Exactly how it unfolded was never fully settled. However, the outcome was undeniable. The rejection led to a period of heavy despair. Later biographical anecdotes described episodes of self-harm during this time, noting an emotional crisis. Following this devastating heartbreak, her mother took her across the European marriage markets. She presented Eugénie in the drawing rooms of Madrid, London, and Paris. Suitors consistently praised her physical beauty, but the courtships ended there. Her independent nature, foreign nationality, and lack of a large fortune made her an impractical choice for aristocrats. Her path eventually led her back to Paris. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was maneuvering from the presidency to the imperial throne. After years of appearing in drawing rooms without finding a match, she encountered the man who could make her the symbol of a reborn empire. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte understood the political limits of his title. As the nephew of Napoleon I, his unconventional path had moved from foreign exile and a prison cell to becoming president of the French Republic before he took the title of Emperor Napoleon III. But to the older royal houses of Europe, the Bonaparte family remained unproven newcomers, lacking dynastic legitimacy. A new empire required a secure bloodline and immediate international recognition. When a proposed marriage to Princess Carola of Vasa failed to materialize due to political hesitation, the emperor looked away from established courts. In January 1853, he formally asked for Eugénie's hand. The decision immediately met fierce resistance within the imperial palace. Key members of his family and several influential state ministers opposed the match. Some accounts hold that the emperor initially sought a discreet, unofficial arrangement, and that she refused any path that did not end in legitimate marriage. The private conversations were never recorded, but what survives is the emperor's public declaration. He announced he was choosing a woman he genuinely loved and respected. He deliberately rejected the tradition of forming a political alliance with an unknown foreign royal. For a woman who had previously faced quiet, aristocratic rejections, the reversal was clear. She was not selected by a minor nobleman. She was publicly chosen by the ruler of France. Yet, the choice of one man did not ensure the loyalty of an entire imperial court. The civil ceremony took place inside the Tuileries Palace on January 29, 1853, followed by a religious service the next morning at Notre-Dame de Paris. The cathedral bells rang across the city as she walked down the aisle. At 26 years old, Eugénie reached one of the highest positions a woman could hold. She became Empress Consort of the French. Though not a ruling monarch by birthright, her new title demanded relentless public performance. The official wedding portraits projected a unified dynasty, but reality within the palace corridors was deeply fractured. A vocal faction of the old nobility felt the emperor had married below his station. They viewed his new Spanish wife as an ambitious outsider. A Spanish woman stepping onto the French throne invited immediate historical comparisons. The court quietly whispered the name of Marie Antoinette. Both women had arrived in Paris from foreign countries. Both would heavily influence the dominant aesthetic of their respective eras. Both would eventually face a hostile press, eager to criticize their extensive household spending. Whether Eugénie truly saw the former queen as a warning for her own life is impossible to prove. But her interest in Marie Antoinette's legacy was well documented. It was a subtle caution she carried through all her years in Paris. The woman who had once faced quiet aristocratic rejections was now the Empress of France, but she was stepping into a critical court that watched her every move. The royal wedding brought Eugénie to the center of European power, where she quickly defined the aesthetic of an entire era. But she also had to prove her capability extended beyond mere ceremonial duties on the throne. The Tuileries Palace became the undisputed center of Parisian court life. State balls, ceremonies, and curated art projected the Second Empire at its peak. Eugénie shaped the style of the continent, and the world watched her choices. Her patronage helped English-born designer Charles Frederick Worth establish the first true haute couture house in Paris. She did not invent the trade on her own, but she determined its direction. To her admirers, she was the symbol of modern elegance. To her political critics, she was merely the chiffon fairy, a title meant to dismiss her intellect. The nickname revealed how a portion of Paris preferred to view her. Critics reduced her cultural influence to silk dresses and excessive royal spending. Painter Franz Xaver Winterhalter captured this era in his famous portrait of the Empress and her ladies. On his canvas, the empire appeared to have no shadows. During these prosperous years, she developed a crucial working friendship with Britain's Queen Victoria. The public saw a woman defining European taste, often judging her solely by her attire at state dinners. But the woman dismissed as a mere fashion symbol would soon prove her capabilities when handed the working machinery of the French state. On 3 separate occasions during the reign, the emperor left Paris for extended military or diplomatic campaigns, formally appointing his wife as regent. Eugénie shared the daily council of ministers. She handled official state dispatches and formally represented the French government. She did not rule the country continuously, but her administrative duties were a matter of public record. She used her position to support female education. She publicly backed Julie Victoire d'Aubier, who became the first woman to pass the French baccalaureate. The exam was not a university degree, but it served as the required gateway into higher education for women. In the autumn of 1869, the Empress traveled across the Mediterranean to Egypt. She presided over the formal opening ceremonies of the Suez Canal. The voyage stood as one of the last major prestige events of the Second Empire. It highlighted the central paradox of her royal life. The woman, often described as a palace ornament, carried genuine diplomatic responsibility on the world stage. Yet, her authority remained conditional. Her political power existed only because of her husband's position. It was a borrowed influence, and it could not protect her from what was happening in the private quarters. While she successfully shaped the image of a global empire outside the state rooms, the early promise of her marriage was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain behind the closed doors of their private apartments. The marriage began with a public declaration of affection, explicitly rejecting traditional political alliances. Yet, the reality inside the private apartments proved vastly different. The historical record suggests Eugénie found physical intimacy difficult. Within a few short years, the relationship between the emperor and empress began to noticeably cool. The distance was not just physical. Napoleon III actively sought companionship outside the confines of the marriage. He maintained several extramarital relationships throughout his reign, and some of these affairs soon became public knowledge across the imperial court. Names of mistresses, most notably Marguerite Bélanger, famously known as Laughing Margot, frequently appeared in the quiet conversations of the nobility. While the palace maintained a formal silence, the household staff inevitably noticed where the emperor spent his private time. Despite the growing marital distance, the primary political duty of the royal marriage remained untouched. The newly established empire desperately required a male heir. An early pregnancy in 1853 had ended in a devastating miscarriage. The physical toll on the empress was incredibly heavy, and the political pressure from the French state grew steadily with each passing month. A ruling house without a clear line of succession was highly vulnerable to its internal and external enemies. Fortunately, by the winter of 1855, she was pregnant once again. This child was no longer just a matter of basic family continuity. The unborn baby represented the primary hope for the immediate future of the Bonaparte dynasty. For a woman whose husband was increasingly looking elsewhere, a legitimate heir offered the most secure position in a notoriously fractured court. On March 16, 1856, the Empress endured a remarkably difficult labor. She successfully gave birth to a son, known as the Prince Imperial, who became the sole direct heir to the French throne. The official baptism took place at Notre Dame on June 14th. The chosen godparents were Pope Pius IX and Queen Josephine of Sweden. Though Queen Victoria was not named as an official godmother, the British monarch maintained a remarkably close bond with the growing family. It was a vital diplomatic connection that would matter greatly in the coming decades. For the French state, the young boy was a strict political necessity. For Eugénie, however, he was the absolute center of her world. As the marriage grew colder, she poured all her attention into her only son. Yet, she could not raise him as an ordinary child. He was meticulously educated within the grand myth of the Bonaparte name. From a very young age, the boy was systematically prepared for a strict military life. He wore a miniature uniform and learned that his family name carried a heavy martial duty. This aggressive education worried his mother as international tensions shifted. When Prussia emerged as a major rival after the Battle of Sadowa, Eugénie feared immensely for her son's inheritance. Some accounts attribute aggressive political quotes to her from this tense period, though historians still disagree on how much weight to give them. What is not in doubt is her deep anxiety over protecting the crown for the next generation. Raising a boy to believe the throne strictly required military glory was a highly dangerous path. As the Prince Imperial grew older, the emperor's health visibly declined, and Eugénie's political authority became much more visible. But France was rapidly accelerating toward a disastrous military confrontation that would systematically dismantle the exact future she was trying so desperately to secure. By the late 1860s, the emperor's health began to fail. He suffered from painful bladder stones, managing daily pain that restricted his public presence and his capacity to govern the country. As his physical strength declined, the Empress took on more administrative duties. Eugénie handled a larger volume of state dispatches and attended the Council of Ministers during his periods of illness. Her rising visibility created an immediate political backlash. A foreign-born woman holding executive authority became a primary target for the Parisian press. Caricatures in the papers linked her to royal extravagance, conservative religious factions, and the unpopular domestic policies of the state. Not all the criticism was based on prejudice. She belonged to the ruling class and held clear political views of her own. Yet most assessments agree her direct influence over the emperor's final decisions stayed limited. She did not dictate the policies of the French state, but she became one of the most accessible symbols of its flaws. The historical comparison to Marie Antoinette grew sharper in the public mind. Once again, a foreign royal wife was transformed into the public face of a struggling regime. In the summer of 1870, a diplomatic dispute over a German candidate for the Spanish throne escalated tensions between France and Prussia. The Prussian Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, recognized a political opportunity. He edited and released a diplomatic communication known as the Ems Dispatch, deliberately altering the wording to make the insult to French national honor appear sharper. The Parisian press and the crowds in the streets of Paris demanded military retaliation. The French government moved toward conflict in an atmosphere of provoked national pride. In the decades that followed, some accounts claimed Eugénie actively pushed for the conflict, hoping a military victory would secure the throne for the Prince Imperial. The line, "This is my war," was widely attributed to her by her political enemies. The truth was more complicated. The Empress did support the declaration of war, but her role was never the single deciding factor. She herself repeatedly denied ever speaking the famous line. She was not fully removed from the administration, and she shared in the government's collective responsibility. However, the complex military escalation of two major European powers could not be reduced to the ambition of a single mother. In July of 1870, after formally appointing Eugénie as regent, Napoleon III left Paris for the military front. Despite his deteriorating health and chronic pain, he took command of the army. He brought the Prince Imperial, who was only 14 years old, with him to the battlefield. Whatever the distribution of blame at the palace, France was now at war. But the first telegrams from the front lines would quickly turn the promise of a swift victory into a succession of defeats. Napoleon III took command at the front while managing chronic illness. He brought the Prince Imperial, who was only 14 years old, to the battlefield. During the early engagement at Saarbrücken, the boy stood close to active artillery fire. He picked up a spent Prussian bullet from the battlefield and kept it as a souvenir. The French press praised the incident as a demonstration of royal bravery. In Paris, however, a terrified mother had to read reports of her only son standing directly in the line of enemy fire. The French military had entered the conflict, issuing confident declarations of victory. The reality on the ground proved different. Prussia mobilized its forces much faster. They utilized a superior railway network and well-organized supply lines. The early optimism of the empire dissolved into a succession of sharp defeats. As the front lines collapsed, Eugénie governed Paris in her role as regent. She chaired emergency council meetings and read the constantly arriving military dispatches. The demands of the state left her little time for rest. She managed the fracturing government on minimal sleep and strong coffee. The atmosphere inside the royal residence began to shift as the casualty lists grew longer. Key court officials quietly prepared for their own safety. Even some of the household staff began removing valuable items from the palace rooms. The contrast with her earlier reign was impossible to ignore. The famous Winterhalter portrait had shown a court bathed in light, without a single shadow in sight. Now, the Tuileries Palace was steadily losing its people, its loyalty, and its authority. The political foundations of the empire were rapidly disintegrating long before the final military blow arrived. The government waited in tense anticipation. A single devastating telegram from the Battle of Sedan was about to turn a severe military crisis into the official collapse of the Second Empire. On September 2nd, 1870, Napoleon III surrendered his forces at Sedan. The ruler of the French state was now a prisoner of war. The news reached Paris shortly after. The record suggests Eugénie reacted with immediate, sharp anger. She struggled to accept that a French emperor had allowed himself to be taken alive by the enemy. This response was not necessarily a reflection of her private marital feelings. She had been educated within the sweeping myth of Napoleon I. In that strict political tradition, the title of emperor and military honor were inseparable. Surrender was viewed as an unforgivable breaking of the Bonaparte legacy. By September 4th, the citizens of Paris gathered in the streets. The crowds demanded an immediate end to the empire and formally declared a republic. The Tuileries Palace was not defenseless. The royal residence was still defended by loyal elements of the imperial guard and retained the physical capacity to repel the advancing crowds. As the acting regent, Eugénie possessed the legal authority to order the soldiers to fire. She could have demanded the use of military force to hold her position. Instead, she explicitly refused to shed French blood to maintain the family throne. The historical shadow of Marie Antoinette finally offered a clear, undeniable lesson. Eugénie understood the danger of a foreign-born queen presiding over the deaths of Parisian citizens. She recognized that violence would permanently stain her family's name. It is also true that the broader political situation was likely beyond any military recovery. The empire had already lost its remaining legitimacy on the battlefield at Sedan. While she ultimately could not save the Second Empire, she consciously chose not to defend it with an armed confrontation inside the palace gates. It was a decision rooted in pragmatism rather than grand heroism. The crown was gone, but the decision on how to leave remained hers. With the angry crowds pressing closer, she left the Tuileries Palace behind. She was no longer acting as the Empress of the French. She was no longer the regent issuing state orders. She was now simply a woman needing to find a secure route out of the capital. Eugénie left the Tuileries through the corridors that had witnessed all her grand ceremonies, but the citizens of Paris no longer treated her as their sovereign empress. Eugénie left the Tuileries Palace accompanied by a small group of attendants. She moved quickly through the long corridors connecting the royal residence to the Louvre Museum. She had once walked these same halls dressed for grand state ceremonies. Now she was simply a woman trying to find a secure exit before the angry crowds arrived. As later accounts tell it, she paused in the quiet galleries to look up at Théodore Géricault's famous painting, The Raft of the Medusa. The tragic image of survivors adrift at sea was the last piece of art she saw before leaving the museum. She exited through an unremarkable side door and stepped onto the streets of Paris. The woman who had ruled the country now needed a safe place to hide. The group went to the home of a trusted friend, but the house was empty. They moved to a second address, seeking shelter from the rising unrest. The servant at the door recognized who she was, but explicitly refused to let her inside. Her royal position had once granted her access to almost any building in the empire. Now, that same title made her too dangerous to shelter. With her options vanishing, she remembered Thomas Evans. He was a prominent American dentist who frequently treated members of the royal family. She arrived at his residence and directly asked for his protection. By one account of the meeting, she told him her luck had finally run out. Evans offered her safety inside his walls, but hiding an ousted empress in the middle of a collapsing capital was only a temporary measure. He now had to find a secure way to get her out of France entirely. Thomas Evans secured a travel pass connected to the British Embassy. The group created a sudden, necessary fiction to bypass the local authorities. Eugénie disguised herself as an ailing woman traveling to the coast for her health. Her companions took on the distinct roles of her attending doctor, a concerned relative, and a medical nurse. They left Paris in a closed carriage and headed toward Normandy. The journey required them to change vehicles multiple times and board regional trains for certain stretches of the route. They passed through tense military checkpoints with only limited funds and the food they could carry in their bags. In a quiet moment on the road, Eugénie used a small pocket knife to divide bread and cold meat for the group. The woman who had once commanded a royal court now prepared a simple, rationed meal inside a moving carriage. At one point in a provincial town, the careful disguise nearly slipped. One account has it that she saw a local policeman acting harshly toward a citizen in the street. For a brief second, she forgot her new reality and stepped forward with the authority of an empress to stop him. Evans quickly intervened, signaling to the officer that his patient was unwell. The tense moment passed, and they continued their journey to the coast. They finally reached the coastal town of Deauville and found an English aristocrat, Sir John Burgoyne, with a small yacht named the Gazelle. He agreed to take the small group across the English Channel. The sea was rough, and the crossing carried genuine physical risk, but they made it through the storm without being pursued. Eugénie arrived in England with little more than the clothes she was wearing, but she also found the Prince Imperial waiting for her. She had lost the throne, the country, and her royal status. Yet, she still had her son, and her husband was still alive as a prisoner. In that brief moment, the family could believe the worst of the crisis was behind them. In England, the Bonaparte family would reunite in a leased house rather than a grand palace. But Napoleon III's remaining time was rapidly running out. The Bonaparte family settled at Camden Place, a private estate in Chislehurst, Kent. Napoleon III was eventually released from military captivity and reunited with his wife and son. The physical reality of their exile offered a striking, quiet contrast to their former existence. They no longer governed from the vast state rooms of the Tuileries Palace. The three of them now lived as a family in a country house with a garden. Though the ousted emperor still considered the possibility of a political return to France and closely monitored the news from Paris, his rapidly failing health made any such attempt impossible. His chronic bladder stones caused severe pain and required repeated medical interventions. Ultimately, a final surgical operation could not save him. On January 9th, 1873, Napoleon III passed away. Whatever the public fractures or private infidelities of their marriage, he had defined nearly 2 decades of Eugénie's life. His passing left her a widow in a foreign country. The Prince Imperial was now the recognized head of the Bonaparte house. He was the primary family member remaining in her daily life. He also became the sole focus of political loyalists who still hoped to restore the empire. But the young man had no intention of spending his life as a symbolic figure waiting in the English countryside. The Prince Imperial enrolled at the Royal Military Academy, Woolwich. He trained alongside regular Army cadets and completed his formal education with an uncompromising conviction. He had been raised on the sweeping military history of his family. He believed a legitimate claim to the French throne had to be validated by actual military glory. By 1879, Britain was fighting a serious conflict against the Zulu kingdom in southern Africa. The young prince demanded to join the British forces on the campaign. Accounts of his mother's reaction do not fully align. The National Army Museum holds that Eugénie and Queen Victoria intervened on his behalf, securing permission under the explicit condition that he was kept out of danger. The Fondation Napoleon, by contrast, states he joined the campaign despite his mother's direct pleas. Which version is true was never fully settled. Ultimately, whether Eugénie could not stop him or simply chose not to stand in his way, Queen Victoria utilized her diplomatic influence to ensure the reluctant British government allowed him to travel. He was attached to the military command under strict expectations. The army was ordered to keep him away from active combat. The Prince Imperial traveled to Africa with a formal promise of protection, but on June 1st, a minor military reconnaissance mission would render that promise worthless. On June 1st, 1879, the Prince Imperial joined a small reconnaissance mission near Ulundi. He had traveled to southern Africa under a formal promise of protection from the British government. That promise failed in the field. According to the National Army Museum, the patrol proceeded into the territory without its full required military escort. The unit stopped to rest in an area the command mistakenly believed was secure. The men relaxed, and the group failed to maintain an adequate watch around the perimeter. When Zulu warriors suddenly appeared from the tall grass, the British patrol scrambled to mount their horses and retreat. In the frantic rush to escape, a critical piece of equipment failed. A leather saddle strap broke as the prince tried to pull himself onto his horse. He fell heavily to the ground and was instantly separated from the escaping soldiers. Left alone on foot, he could not outrun the ambush. Later, historical accounts emphasize that he bravely stood his ground and directly faced his attackers. He fought until the very end. The prince died in the field at 23 years old. When the official news finally reached the exiled family's leased house in England, the political consequences were immediate and permanent. The young man was the recognized symbolic heir to the Bonaparte legacy. His tragic death effectively ended the most viable hope of restoring a Bonaparte emperor to the French throne. But for Eugénie, the devastating aftermath could not simply be reduced to international politics. She had successfully survived the sudden collapse of a global empire. She had endured the loss of her adopted country and the death of her husband. She managed those profound losses because she still had her son. Now, her final anchor to the world was gone. A deeply personal, unanswerable question remained. If she had aggressively stopped the military journey, would the outcome have been different? The historical record offers no comfort for that agonizing thought. About a year after the fatal ambush, the widowed mother made a quiet, resolute decision. She arranged a long, demanding journey across the sea to southern Africa. She planned to retrace the final recorded steps of her only child. Eugénie could not change the historical events of that June afternoon, but she could physically travel to the remote site, standing on the exact piece of ground where her dynasty's future had violently ended. In the spring of 1880, Eugénie made the long journey across the sea to southern Africa. She traveled deep into the territory of Zululand to follow the final recorded route of the Prince Imperial. The deposed empress needed to be physically present at the exact site that had violently taken her only child. She eventually reached the isolated valley where the fatal military ambush had occurred. A stone memorial cross, ordered by Queen Victoria, was erected on the precise piece of ground where the young man fell. She did not make this arduous voyage to seek any political forgiveness from the British command. She did not view the pilgrimage as an act of public penance. The reality of the distant location simply offered a necessary, private space for her mourning. It was a completely solitary act of remembrance. She decided to remain at the ambush site overnight, keeping a quiet vigil near the memorial cross. According to accounts from her traveling companions, she noticed Zulu warriors standing silently just beyond the firelight. No record ever confirmed whether these were the same men who had fought the British patrol. There was no exchange of words in the dark. There was no sudden resolution to her grief. She simply kept her watch in the quiet valley until the morning light finally appeared. When dawn broke, the former empress finally walked away from the isolated site. The overnight vigil could not undo the permanent loss of her family line. It was merely the final action a devastated mother could take for a son who was never coming home. The long pilgrimage did not mark the end of her story. The woman who had tragically lost her crown, her adopted country, her husband, and her heir would survive for another 40 years. Eugénie left the valley and returned to England, where she began building a space to hold her husband, her son, and their lost world securely in memory. After returning from her pilgrimage to the African continent, Eugénie established a permanent residence in England. She purchased Farnborough Hill, a stately estate in Hampshire. The former empress needed a secure resting place for her family. In the early 1880s, she began construction on St. Michael's Abbey, near her new home. The completed stone structure was designed to hold the remains of Napoleon III and the Prince Imperial. Queen Victoria provided massive coffins carved from Scottish granite for the royal crypt. Eugénie frequently visited the abbey to pray quietly beside her husband and son. The main house rapidly became a curated archive of the Bonaparte dynasty. She filled the spacious rooms with official portraits, tapestries, and personal items recovered from France. By her own biographer's account, she liked to call the vast estate simply her cottage. The casual term mirrored her documented historical interest in Marie Antoinette's rural retreats. Much of the surviving personal legacy of the French Second Empire was now maintained by one widowed woman in the English countryside. Yet, she did not spend the rest of her life entirely isolated in mourning. The Fondation Napoleon's records show she continued to travel extensively across Europe. She diligently maintained diplomatic correspondence and occasionally intervened in later political matters. She had built a grand sanctuary for the dead, but remained actively engaged with the changing world around her. She lived long enough to watch several other ruling dynasties rise and fall. Eugénie outlived her husband by 47 years and survived her only son by 41 years. As the decades passed, she witnessed the profound transformation of the European political order. When the Great War broke out, she opened the doors of her English estate to the military. The Fondation Napoleon's records confirm the property functioned as a working military hospital from 1914 to 1918. One anecdote has it that she preferred the daily presence of young and pleasant nurses on the medical wards. She regularly walked the long halls of her home, quietly speaking with wounded soldiers from a modern war her son did not live to fight. In the spring of 1920, the aging empress traveled back to her native Spain and stayed in Madrid. While there, she underwent successful cataract surgery to treat her rapidly failing eyesight. The surgical intervention restored her clear vision for her final weeks. On July 11, 1920, Eugénie passed away in Madrid. She had reached 94 years of age. The Spanish woman who had once ruled the French Empire died quietly in the country of her birth. Her remains were carefully transported back across the water to England. A formal procession eventually brought her back to St. Michael's Abbey. She was carried down into the quiet stone crypt. There, she was finally laid to rest with the stone coffin of Napoleon III on one side and the Prince Imperial on the other. When Eugénie was placed between her husband and her son, the historical narrative was no longer merely about what she had lost. It was about how she utilized the decades that remained after those profound losses. She began as a young Spanish aristocrat who felt she was rarely the first choice, until Napoleon III publicly selected her as his wife, making her the Empress Consort of the French in 1853. Over the next 17 years, she actively shaped the visual identity of the Second Empire. She served 3 terms as the regent and presided over major international diplomatic events. She did not govern the state continuously, but her influence was firmly recorded. She was never just a chiffon fairy in a silk dress or a beautiful face in a winter halter painting. The initial public declaration of love did not protect the private marriage. As their relationship cooled, the Prince Imperial became the intersection of her personal hope and the dynasty's future. Then the losses arrived in quick succession. The Franco-Prussian War in 1870 decisively destroyed the throne. The sudden exile removed her from her adopted country. By 1873, a chronic illness took her husband. 6 years later, a foreign battlefield took her only son. No single political decision she made caused this entire sequence of events. The heaviest burden was not just losing everything, but having to survive for so long afterward. No single record reveals exactly what belief kept her going, yet her actions, well documented, trace a quiet transformation. When she held political power, she tried to secure an empire and an heir. After the collapse, she chose to protect their memory. She traveled across the sea to the site where her son fell, built a stone abbey for her family, and filled her final home with recovered artifacts, eventually opening those doors to wounded soldiers. The grief never vanished, but she gave her remaining decades a clear function. At the red brick estate in Hampshire, she walked daily among the relics of a vanished era. In life, Eugénie could not save her husband or her son from their early deaths, but for more than 40 years, she ensured the memory of the world they belonged to would not disappear. How do you view her final decades? Was she a political exile or a dedicated guardian of history? Share your thoughts below. Like this video and subscribe to Crown Secrets and Scandals for more stories the Crown left out of the official record.